There exists a line of thought from the late 18th century so clear and relentless that it remains relevant today. It's encapsulated in a sentence that exposes a truth too uncomfortable to even be brought before the court of public judgment. No man is wise enough to govern another. If that sentence were placed at the center of our entire social structure, it could declare, once and for all, the end of war. Because every war, every oppressive system, every institutionalized violence is born from the single assumption that someone, somewhere in the world, has the right to decide over the life and death of others. That someone has the power to command, to rule, to sacrifice human beings in the name of a higher order, a homeland, a people, an ideal, or a border. But if no man is truly wise enough to govern another, then no government can ever again justify its authority through force and violence. These ideas came from one of the most rigorous, rational, and sadly forgotten thinkers in the history of philosophy, William Godwin. At the end of the 18th century, he boldly stated that every form of government, even democracy, tends toward tyranny, and that the state, in any form, is always an obstacle to the moral development of the human being. Decades later, even Abraham Lincoln would say, "No man is good enough to govern another without the other's consent." There is no direct evidence that Lincoln read the English philosopher, but their words seem to touch upon the same unsettling truth. Moreover, Godwin's ideas were widely circulated among European and American intellectual circles in the 19th century. It's entirely plausible that Lincoln, even without reading him directly, was still influenced by that broader current of thought the English writer had helped to spread decades earlier. Born in 1756 in Wisbech, England, William Godwin was raised in a deeply religious family. His father was a dissenting minister, and young William received a strictly Puritan education based on the Bible and discipline. But he soon began to question everything he had been taught. He studied philosophy, theology, and science with an almost mystical obsession, gradually shifting from religious fanaticism to radical rationalism, and eventually to a clear-eyed, disillusioned form of atheism. His thinking was deeply shaped by the French Enlightenment, Rousseau, Voltaire, d'Holbach, and especially by the English theologian Joseph Priestley, who inspired in him a worldview centered on reason, individual freedom, and equality. But it was David Hartley's observations on man that gave him the theoretical foundation he had been searching for, a revolutionary idea of the human mind as something that could be shaped, improved, and formed through experience. Godwin believed that people were not born evil, but corrupted by institutions, and among all of them, the most dangerous was government. In 1793, he published his most famous work, Enquiry Concerning Political Justice, a book that shook the very foundations of British intellectual life. It wasn't an easy book, nor one written for the masses, but it became a landmark for generations of radical thinkers, artists, and rebellious youth. Godwin argued that power in any form breeds moral corruption. Whoever holds authority inevitably begins to act in their own interest, and whoever submits to authority loses the ability to judge for themselves, to think independently, to be truly free. His view was uncompromising. There are no good governments. There are only systems of control, more or less sophisticated. Even democracy, which many today consider the height of civilization, was for him a moral trap. Because even when people vote, they still delegate to others the right to decide for everyone. And whoever is elected, no matter how enlightened, inevitably becomes a prisoner of power's logic, compromise, propaganda, self-interest, and above all, lies. He was not a violent revolutionary. On the contrary, he believed in gradual change through education and dialogue. Human beings, in his eyes, were perfectible, capable of evolving, of bettering themselves over time if placed in the right conditions. Therefore, if properly educated, they would come to recognize for themselves the futility of oppressive institutions. And for this reason, he envisioned a world without governments, without laws imposed from above, without hierarchies as we know them today. He imagined a society built upon local communities where human relationships were direct, authentic, and free from any corruptible authoritarian mediation. He wrote, "Every man should be the judge of his own actions," a sentence that sounds like a call to personal responsibility. For him, freedom didn't mean doing whatever one wanted. It meant developing within oneself the ability to decide consciously without the need for threatening masters. Only in this way could human beings become truly autonomous, breaking free from the logic of blind obedience and building a society rooted in critical thinking, dialogue, and mutual respect. But to reach that autonomy, one first had to unmask a powerful, invisible enemy. Godwin wrote, "The true enemy of man is credulity," identifying this mental disposition as the fertile ground from which all forms of domination grow. Those who believe blindly, who accept without questioning, become easy prey for those who impose rules, ideologies, religions, or established powers. Credulity breeds passivity, tames the mind, and hollows out freedom. That's why, above all, education should teach people to question and to never passively accept what the political class presents as inevitable or just. It was 1797 when Godwin, at the age of 41, married Mary Wollstonecraft, one of the first and most brilliant feminists in history, author of the famous A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. It was a deep union, born out of mutual respect for each other's ideas, constant dialogue, and a rare intellectual connection. That same year, Mary became pregnant. But life, too often, has a cruel taste. Just days after the birth of their only daughter, Mary died. It was a devastating blow. The newborn was named Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, almost as if to keep her mother's name alive in the heart of tragedy. Raised among manuscripts, ideals, and heavy absences, that child transformed grief into art, becoming a writer known around the world, forever remembered for a novel that has survived the centuries. In time, she took her husband's surname and became Mary Shelley. She was still very young when, in 1818, she wrote Frankenstein. Everything now associated with that name, monsters, mad science, rebellion against human limits, was born from her imagination. And that novel, born in the shadow of a life marked by loss, felt like a scream etched onto paper. A creature made of pain, intelligence, and solitude. A creature that, perhaps, was just a way of telling her own story. She lived between London, Scotland, and Italy, often moving alongside Percy Shelley and their ideals, constantly suspended between restlessness and the search for inner refuge. Her relationship with her father was complex. On one hand, he raised her with a degree of freedom and open-mindedness unthinkable for the time. On the other, he never fully approved of her relationship with the poet. And yet, through pain, misunderstanding, and fracture, Mary Shelley always remained connected to her father's radical and independent thinking. In a way, she became the living continuation of his utopia. William Godwin died in London in 1836 at the age of 80. After a life devoted to writing, education, and the spread of critical thought, he was buried next to his wife Mary Wollstonecraft in the St. Pancras Cemetery. But years later, it was Mary Shelley who had both of them exhumed and transferred to Bournemouth Cemetery, so they could remain together even in death. A symbolic closure for a family that had woven life, ideas, grief, and immortal works into something truly unrepeatable. Is it possible that today, in 2025, William Godwin's ideas are still alive, uncomfortable, and incredibly relevant? Maybe so, precisely because they strike a nerve in our time. In an era that multiplies forms of control, turns obedience into virtue, and treats autonomy as a threat, returning to these ideas becomes a necessary act. Godwin offered a dangerous idea in its simplicity. True freedom begins the moment we stop outsourcing our own judgment. Of course, imagining a world governed by small autonomous communities without central authorities might seem almost utopian today. Perhaps there is no perfect model, but that makes it all the more important to ask whether the path we're following is truly the only one possible. Because entrusting one man and his team with the power to declare wars, control lives, and manage forces that no human being can fully understand is not just blind faith. It's a real and devastating danger for the entire world.